So in today's video, I'm sharing how to start inner child healing in codependency recovery. But if you're new, my name is Michelle Ferris and I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So in codependency recovery, we're really learning how to create mutually satisfying relationships without sacrificing who we are and without losing ourselves in the process. And with inner child work, it's about tapping into that childlike part of us that needs healing. So they go hand in hand. But if you're in codependency recovery, say me too in the comments. I'm right there with you. So what does doing inner child work even mean? It basically means starting to connect and commit to getting to know that inner child part of you that feels really vulnerable. That may be the part of you that is taking things personally and overreacting at times. Not because you're bad or wrong, because that inner child part of us is where the pain is. That's where we've been hurt in our families growing up. So there needs to be some level of inner child work in any stage of recovery, especially codependency recovery. Because in codependency, we don't have a strong connection to ourselves. So inner child work can be a really great way to develop more self-esteem and self-worth. If you have ever connected with your inner child, say me too in the comments, because you're in the right place. So why is inner child healing so important in codependency recovery? Well, when you think about it, most people who are codependent grow up in dysfunctional families where their needs were not met. In fact, maybe you found yourself taking care of your parents or taking care of your siblings and learning that you couldn't have any wants and needs because the adults' issues were too big and they didn't know how to parent you. When we grow up with codependent tendencies, we learn not to take up space. We don't have a strong sense of self. We're really good at becoming the chameleon and changing who we are so that we can get the love and support we didn't get growing up. So who we are gets lost. And that's why inner child work is so important, because it's going to help you re-engage with that part of yourself. So let's talk about how to do that. So the purpose of inner child work is to connect to that childlike part of you and to start reparenting them. And what I mean by that is when you think of that child inside of you, they probably weren't parented effectively. They probably were neglected or abused in some way or in several ways, which left you feeling not enough or empty, especially in social situations. So our job in codependency recovery is to learn how to connect with that part of ourselves, because part of codependency is building a stronger sense of self. So there's two ways we typically do that in our recovery. One is the adult part of us, and that's the part in codependency recovery where you're working on self-care, you're working to set boundaries, you're assessing your relationships. That's all the stuff our adult needs to do in recovery in order to heal. But the childlike part of us is usually more around feeling unworthy, or feeling like you can't contain your feelings because they're so big, or you might get really easily triggered in your relationships. That's the part that tends to surface sometimes right away in recovery, and sometimes it may take a few years before you really start to realize, okay, there's a deeper level of work I need to get to. And that's why inner child work almost always requires the help of a therapist. You can do some of this stuff alone, but for the most part, especially if you have a history of a lot of abuse and trauma, I really want you to consider getting a therapist so that you can get the support you need. But here are some ways that you can start to connect with your inner child. The first way is by journaling. And how I recommend doing this is you take your dominant hand, the hand you normally write with, and you write them a letter, or you write them some questions. And then with your non-dominant hand, you let the childlike part of you answer. Now, I know this doesn't make logical sense, but for some reason, writing with your non-dominant hand accesses a different part of the brain. I've done this many times in my recovery, and it always surprises me how basic but true and powerful those answers are with my non-dominant hand. Another way to connect with them is to visualize who they were. So, for instance, closing your eyes and just visualizing who you were as a child. Maybe a certain age is going to come up for you. Maybe you'll see a certain dress you wore or uniform. And then I want you to imagine you meeting your inner child in a safe place that you can create in your mind. This might be in nature, or this might be a home that's very protected, so your inner child feels super safe. Using visualization to meet your inner child can be a really powerful way to get started. And what I want you to do is I don't want you to judge yourself for how it looks, because sometimes when we meet our inner child, they're pretty mad. And they might be blaming us for what happened to them. So they might be across the room from us. They might not want anything to do with us at first. Sometimes that happens, and if it does, that's okay. Because what I want you to do is just meet your inner child where they're at with no judgment. No matter how they show up, I want you to just be with them, because that is the first step in building a connection with that part of yourself. We don't want to make them wrong. Because what I want you to do is I want you to love them no matter how they show up in this visualization. Because that is the first step in parenting yourself, is to just try to make a connection. The next thing I want you to do to connect with your inner child is to find a comfort item that would self-soothe that part of you. For me, it was a stuffed dog. I absolutely loved it. It was big, and I would hug it whenever I would get really nervous or really scared. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about a toy, a blanket, some comfort item from your childhood that you wish you had or you did have that you could actually use right now as a way to connect to that part of yourself. Because what we don't want is we don't want our inner child to run amok. One of the things I've noticed is if we don't have healthy comforts, we're going to have unhealthy comforts, like using alcohol or food or pot or any other substances or compulsive behavior to self-soothe. And I don't want that for you. I want you to create something healthy, something that isn't going to harm you in any way, because that can be a really healthy way to start reparenting that inner child. So how can you start to build a lasting connection to your inner child? Here's what I want you to start doing, is I want you to start checking in with them emotionally. And I know this sounds silly, but I want you to ask them, how are you feeling today? What do you need today? And just see if you can hear an answer. First, you might dismiss it and think it's silly or you're making it up. It's okay. If you need to do the dominant and non-dominant writing, do that. But I want you to start tapping into that part of yourself. And the easiest time to do that is when you're feeling really emotional, because that's typically when the child shows up. And that's when they need your comfort and they need to be heard. So sometimes what I used to do is I would just talk to myself. I would talk to that part of myself because that was something I could do to comfort and to hear them. But the most important thing is to just start connecting to them. What I wouldn't do is don't commit to checking in every day or I'm going to take care of you all the time if you're not ready to make that commitment. So instead of making a commitment directly to them and letting them down because maybe you're not ready to do that work yet, just start checking in with them and see how that feels to you. Now, another thing you may need to do is you may need to earn back their trust, because when we connect with our inner child, they're upset and they feel abandoned and they feel like we haven't been there for them. Again, we don't want to judge that because nobody protected them growing up. And if they start lashing out at your adult self, that's just part of the process. Your inner child may have some anger, and we just need to allow that and not make them wrong for it. So it may take a while for them to start to trust you, and that's okay. So the next thing I want you to start doing is notice when you're starting to abandon yourself. When you're starting to discount how you feel or what you need or what you want, or telling yourself you better say yes and never say no, because all of those ways are dishonoring that inner child in you. So part of the recovery process is to learn how not to abandon yourself. So the next thing I want you to do is go watch my video on how to stop abandoning yourself and build self-trust. Thanks so much.